This time on Legal Logic, we'll be taking a closer look at the role of the jury. Trial by jury is a vital part of our democracy. Serving on a jury is participating in government. Our right to a trial by jury maintains the right to have your fellow citizens decide your fate. Furthermore, it ensures that those fellow citizens are truly representative of your community. As our society continues to change, so do the issues that confront this vital democratic tradition, the jury.
Hello and welcome to Legal Logic. I'm Bonnie Richardson and I'll be hosting today's program. Today we'll be discussing the jury and how our jury system requires us all to participate. And we'll also be looking at some of the challenges that face the 21st century jury. I'm joined by several guests who bring a wealth of firsthand knowledge about juries with them. Jan Kitchell from the law firm of Schwabe, Williamson & Wyatt, and Judge Janice Wilson, formerly served on the Multnomah County Circuit Court for, I believe, almost 22 years, and Kirsten Snowden, Deputy District Attorney for Multnomah County, and Bruce Boyd, Songus Litigation Consulting. Welcome to everybody. I'd like to start with a sweeping but true statement. The jury is an American institution, and the United States leads the world in jury trials. So why is the jury so important in our system today? Judge Wilson?
Well, it's the backbone of our democracy. It is the one place in which members of our community participate most directly in governing themselves. We talk about government of the people, by the people, for the people. The jury represents that. They are the conscience of the community. They say what is reasonable behavior in our community and set those standards and hold people to those standards, whether it's a corporation, an individual, or their own government.
You know, I think it's interesting that most of the juries in the world take place in this country. I think, Jan, you had mentioned that before we started this program. What can you say to that?
Well, I think the reason for that is that this country has a jury system in almost all of its courts for all purposes. Most countries don't. Great Britain has juries in a few limited cases. Canada has juries in a few limited cases. But the United States is, and particularly in state courts, juries are guaranteed by constitutions. So we have them, we use them.
And why is that so important here in the United States?
Well, I think the juries, as Judge Wilson said, set the standards. They are the institution that allows the weak to stand up against the strong. And we have a tendency not to trust one person to make a decision. When we get groups of people together, the group dynamic comes up with often a more accurate decision than any one person could. They share ideas, they go over the evidence, they compare and contrast their own backgrounds and common sense, and working together they can come up with the right decision.
So the jury is a very important part of the American life, but in order for it to succeed, we must participate. So here's a short clip about what to expect when you receive that jury summons in the mail.
In Oregon, all citizens over the age of 18 are eligible for jury duty. Any given Monday, the jury room in the Multnomah County Courthouse will see 150 people present themselves for jury duty.
In selecting jurors for a particular trial, the court clerk randomly selects 15 to 35 potential jurors. This select few will then go to a designated courtroom. The judge will explain the nature of the case, and the attorneys for each party have the opportunity to ask individual jurors questions. This process is known as voir dire and is used to determine whether a potential juror is biased, knows any of the parties, counsel or witness, or should otherwise be excluded from jury duty. Voir dire is also a tool used to achieve an impartial jury. Once the jurors for the trial are selected, they are impaneled and they are administered an oath to truly decide the case according to the law and evidence presented to them at trial.
Welcome back to Legal Logic. I'd like to explore some of the areas mentioned in the video a little further. Probably a good one to start with is, Jan, maybe you can explain what kinds of juries there are and what type of jury do people serve on?
Well, we have two court systems, federal court and state court, and in both those systems we have criminal cases and civil cases. So you could be called to serve on a jury in a criminal case in which you'd be deciding somebody's guilt or innocence of a crime. Or in a civil case, often it's about money, whether someone deserves to receive money from the other side for a breach of contract or a tort. Or you can also serve on a grand jury, which is a preliminary process in which the jury decides if someone can be charged with a crime. Those juries typically take longer, a month.
So when you first get that summons to serve on a jury, do you know which one you're going to be serving on before you go to the courthouse?
No, you don't. You go to a big room in the courthouse and then you are selected from that room to potentially serve on one of those three different types of juries.
And how long, maybe Judge Wilson can talk about this, how long are you expected to serve on a jury?
Well, it varies from county to county, even in state courts in Oregon. And Multnomah County, most recently, I think we're at a 2-day jury term, or for the length of any trial for which you were chosen. It can be a much longer period if you're chosen for the grand jury, and I think Kirsten can address that. We have had, and I hope the budget will allow us to return to a system of one trial or one day. And having that shortened jury term really enables a lot more people to serve and for us to get a broader spectrum, broader demographics from our community at both ends of the spectrum.
And maybe, Kirsten, you can talk about the grand jury. What does that entail? That's criminal only?
It is criminal only, and it consists of a group of 7 people. They generally sit for a month at a time.
A whole month?
A whole month, and it's generally every day for most of the day. It depends on the number of cases on any given day. But in Multnomah County, for example, we tend to have 3 grand juries going at any given time. And we group cases according to broad strokes types of cases so that they become more familiar with those cases. And only the state's witnesses are generally called before the grand jury. There can be some exceptions, but it's a mechanism for checks and balances to ensure that the public is involved in the charging process and that only crimes are being charged, or felonies, it only applies in felony cases, are being charged when appropriate.
I want to go back to what was stated in the video about voir dire. Voir dire is questions that you ask a jury. Can you talk about that some more, Bruce, about what does that entail?
Sure. Voir dire, interestingly, means to tell the truth, and it's a process that is done in different ways in different courts where but usually there's an introduction from the judge, and the judge asks some questions or collects some information. Judge Wilson always used to use a final question where the juror had to relate in just a few words or a sentence how the person who knows them best would describe them. It's a terrific icebreaker. It gave you a real insight into the person. But then you're basically asking questions about experiences and the attitudes that arise from those experiences, looking for bias, because you can't pick your perfect jury. You can only deselect people from your jury who would somehow affect the outcome of the case in an unnatural way that would be different than what would happen if completely neutral people were viewing it. But it's just done through a series of questions back and forth. Sometimes it's done to the whole panel. People raise their hands and say, you know, it's a knee replacement case. How many of you have had a knee replacement or know someone who's had one?
And then once that process is done, asking the questions, voir dire, how are those jurors determined? Who makes that decision?
Well, after the questions are done, there's a period where you can remove a juror for either what's called a peremptory challenge.
Is that the lawyer that does that?
Yes, the lawyer, you know, and it's done in a variety of different ways, but each side gets a certain number of, they're called strikes, typically 3 or 5. If there are multiple parties, there's usually some argument about how many strikes people get. And then there are also challenges for cause, and that's for somebody who has an experience or has an overwhelming bias that is so great that that person simply shouldn't be on this panel. And oftentimes, I mean, it's explained, this is not the case for you. There's another case down the hall that doesn't present the same kinds of problems that this one does for you.
I'm curious, that's what the lawyers do. They go through and make those decisions. But what's the judge's role? Judge Wilson, this is a good question for you. What's your role in helping out with the selection of the jury?
Well, as Bruce mentioned, most judges try to do an introductory process, tell the jurors a little bit about what the case is about, so they have some basis, they understand why they're being asked about certain experiences and beliefs in their life, and collect some of the background information. After that, it really is the lawyer's process, except that it's only the judge who can excuse a juror for cause. So if a lawyer thinks that a juror has expressed opinions or disclosed information because there are some reasons, like they're related to a party or something that the law says they just can't serve on that jury. But if it's a matter of bias, the judge has to make the determination of whether or not that juror can fairly serve. The lawyer just can't just say that person's gone. The lawyer can say, I use a strike, or I want to challenge a particular juror for the so-called peremptory challenges. Those are challenges for which the lawyer does not have to articulate any reason whatsoever. So what I used to tell jurors is you can be excused for almost any reason, and I think that almost is an important caveat. Parties and lawyers cannot use peremptory challenges to get rid of a juror on the basis of race or gender or other protected category. And that is because not only do the parties have a right to a jury of their peers and a relative cross-section of the community, but because those citizens have a right to serve as jurors. And our Supreme Court has said they have a right not to be excused for an improper reason. So the judge will make those determinations.
Well, before delving any further into juries, let's imagine the jury is selected. The case begins. The jury starts its work. The good folks here at MetroEast went out into the community and asked the public if they felt qualified to serve on a jury of their peers. Let's see what they had to say.
The first few cases that we worked on, we had no idea what we were doing as a grand jury.
I think the judge did a very good job laying the ground rules and keeping the jury focused on the facts, and this is what we're here for.
It's about, does the evidence support or not support this?
I think that I should have gotten more education up front because there were many legal terms that myself and my fellow jurors just weren't familiar with.
There's a lot of words and things happening that you don't fully understand. There were so many kind of gray areas and things that didn't make sense to us that we had to wade through, so we were able to write down questions and ask counsel.
These particular lawyers that I was witnessing, they were very manipulative, and maybe that's what lawyers do, is they're trying to win their side, but there's all these little tricks and these little games that they play between each other, and it could be distracting, and I suppose if you're not wise to it, then yeah, they could sway you one way or the other.
And all the people who were coming in as witnesses knew 100 times more than we did about the same subject, so who were we to argue with them about what they saw or what a person might have been guilty of?
I feel like there are some flaws in the system as far as putting 12 people together to judge another person or a situation without some sort of formal training or understanding of law.
Welcome back to Legal Logic. Well, it seems like there are a few responses worth exploring a little further, particularly perhaps the one about education. Maybe Judge Wilson, you can talk about, do you have to have a college degree to serve on a jury?
Absolutely not, but I do take that criticism to heart. And I hope we have made some real advances in the way we conduct jury trials. I will say that the most common complaint I hear from jurors is there's information they wish they had that they didn't hear. Some of that we will never solve, rules of evidence preclude jurors from hearing certain things. And while it is a flawed system in some ways, it's still an incredibly good one. The improvements that I've hoped we've made in recent years is trying to address some of these concerns about helping jurors understand up front in a trial what the case is about, to give them some definitions of legal terms, help them understand what decisions they'll have to make, and give them that kind of framework. In the last few years I was on the bench in both civil and criminal cases, I gave the jurors preliminary instructions on those things in writing. Big change from when I started on the bench, when my introductory instructions were very brief and vague, and it was sort of, you'll hear all about it as we go along, and then all of the detailed instructions came at the end. I completely reversed that by the time that I left, and jurors uniformly said they really appreciated having that background up front. Some of that was a self-interested thing on my part. I had a trial once in which, I was giving definitions of legal terms in the final instructions, and I could see the jurors' faces, and I could see the lights go on. They were like, "Oh, well, that's what that was about."
At the end?
At the end, and I thought, why didn't I just tell them that up front? So I think some of these criticisms are well-founded. I hope we're trying to address them. Fortunately, we're a long ways from the days where we didn't even let jurors take notes or ask questions or give them the information that we need. But you don't need to have that educational background before you come in to serve on a jury.
So you can take notes when you're on a jury and ask questions in some courts?
Yes.
And that's really interesting what judges do. I'm curious from the lawyers, what can lawyers do to help educate the jury?
Lawyers just have to be better communicators, and we can do that, and we are doing that, I think, through the use of visual aids, videotape, PowerPoint presentations, anything that we can use to educate the jurors a little better so that they understand the facts of the case. We need to not talk in legal jargon. We need to talk in plain speak, so that everybody knows what's going on. And of course, it should work, because as a lawyer, if we can educate the jurors, maybe we can win more often if the jurors understand our side of the case. If the other lawyer does a poorer job, then he or she should lose, maybe.
Well, I heard the one person say that he thought the lawyers were manipulating, and but I wonder what's really going on. Kirsten, do you have a comment about that?
Well, obviously no two cases are exactly the same and no two lawyers, so I don't know what was going on in his particular case, but there could have been something palpable in the air or some sort of disdain perhaps between the lawyers. But in general, at least in a criminal case, certainly there are two very distinct sides, and sometimes there is almost no agreement about the facts. Sometimes there's a lot of agreement about the facts, and it's a distinction in terms of how the facts may support a legal standard. And so it's incumbent on both sides or both lawyers to do a good job of articulating to the jury what the legal standard is, what the words mean to them in common sense terms, and how the facts or the testimony from that particular case supports their version of or their interpretation of that legal standard.
Yeah, so, talking about how it's important to educate the jury so you don't have to have a college degree to serve as a juror. What about the other end of that, where you have a lot of background, maybe a lot of bias and partiality? Maybe Bruce, you can talk about how do you cut through that so that you can serve as an impartial juror?
Well, I'm not. I think some, jurors that have particular specialized information and knowledge about the topic of the case become non-testifying experts in the jury room. And they kind of nullify the process. They take over the proceedings because they know more than other people. People feel that they have to defer. And that's the job of jury selection, is to remove those people. But I couldn't echo more what I've been hearing here. It's a clear message in ordinary language and supported with pictures. I mean, the more visual information, people don't learn in just one way. You've got to give them You have to give them verbal information, but you have to reinforce it with visual information, and then they're likely to remember it and be able to use that when they finally get to the moment they've all been waiting for and actually deliberate about the case.
Well, we talk about juries and how important it is to serve, but lately people have been talking about the disappearing jury trial. So maybe we can talk about that. Why is it that we're not seeing as many jury trials? Maybe Judge Wilson, I hate to always start off with you, but you've been on the bench for 22 years.
I have, and the disappearance of the jury trial, especially the civil jury trial where it's much more pronounced, is a grave concern. It's a grave concern of mine, and it's a concern all around the country in both federal and state courts, in federal courts even to a greater degree in state courts. And part of the problem is the expense, the cost of litigation, the cost of experts, some of which isn't a factor that the court can necessarily control. Some of it, I am concerned, is a little bit of loss of faith over time by the lawyers in the jury system. And it's one of those things that builds on itself. If lawyers don't have experience with jury trials, and I really want to hear Jan's comment on this, they're a little more nervous about them, more susceptible to concerns or stories that, oh, it's just, it's such a risk, it's such a gamble, juries are unpredictable. I think you talk to lawyers who have extensive experience with juries, and people like Bruce, and certainly on the criminal side, talk to a criminal attorney and say, actually, no, you can count on jurors. They're reliable, they will come to the right decision almost all the time. And if you don't think it's the right decision, maybe it's because you didn't understand the case as well as the jurors did. But when they lose that confidence, they're more likely, I think, to reach a settlement, maybe one that's not even as favorable to their client as it should be. And the longer that lawyer's career goes on without getting that extensive jury trial experience, the greater the fear becomes, the fewer cases go to trial. And they also don't know how to evaluate their cases. How do you know what the right settlement is? There are other factors to be sure, but the touchstone must be, if we went to trial, what would the verdict be? And then go from there in your negotiations about how it should be settled.
So Jan, I'd like to hear from you about that. You've done quite a few jury trials in your career.
I have. When I started out, we were doing jury trials over a few $100s. My first jury trial involved a fender bender where the car was damaged to the tune of $276, and we tried that to a jury. So
What
I
year
had
was
lots. That was in Multnomah County.
Long time ago.
Long time ago. I'm pretty old now. So, but I have had a lot of jury trials. But I think, as Judge Wilson said, a lot of the younger people coming up simply haven't, and so they're unsure of themselves. They don't know how to evaluate the case. And without jury trials, of course, we can't know how to evaluate a case, because without jury verdicts to fall back on to look at, we don't know what future juries are going to do.
Well, why is it that 12 people deciding a case is better than a judge?
Well, I think 12 people have to work together and compromise, and they have to, so it knocks off the rough edges, the highs and the lows, and they get to share their ideas. They, with 12 people watching witnesses and looking at documentary evidence and photographs, they can, each person will see something a little different, and each person will see something that other people may not have seen. So once all of those facts or impressions get shared, the jury overall is better educated.
I'm curious about from a criminal standpoint too. So you're a prosecutor. You don't normally get to choose whether or not you have a jury, but what are your thoughts about juries in the criminal cases?
Well, first, I want to follow up on what Jan said, because we have a program in Multnomah County where we allow civil lawyers, and they tend to be younger lawyers, younger associates, come in, and for a month at a time they get to try some of the lower level misdemeanor cases. And one of the reasons is because of the lack of civil jury experience that many of these lawyers have, and they want that opportunity, and they want to be able to see what it's like to be in front of a jury and interact with a judge and to persuade people, even if it's not the type of law that they typically practice. From a criminal perspective, though, I'm a big fan of jury trials, and it's not to say that I've never had a verdict that I didn't agree with, but I think Judge Wilson is correct. Almost always you understand that the jury could have seen it differently. And frequently as well, the jury doesn't always have all of the information. And when I walk into a courtroom and I know that someone has robbed a bank 10 times before, but perhaps that jury doesn't know, it can make a difference. But we have rules of evidence for a reason, and perhaps they're not all perfect, but the goal is to make sure that people are judged for what, at least in the criminal realm, what they're accused of at that time, and not based on their prior conduct.
Yeah, so that kind of leads maybe to some of the modern challenges then with juries because of access to technology. I think I hear you saying you don't want the jury to have too much information. So what about the modern challenges? Maybe Bruce, you can talk about some of the things that are facing jury systems today with social media.
Well, social media and the internet in general both present their own challenges for the jury. Social media has become a factor in jury selection because people reveal things on social media that maybe the question isn't asked in open court, or maybe they wouldn't answer in that way in open court. And I think it does create a strange mechanism that we haven't really sorted out. I think the rest of, the ability of jurors during trials to do research and on the various witnesses or the matter itself is strictly damaging.
Mm-hmm.
And,
it's prohibited, right?
It's prohibited, but it's done with such great frequency that it's hard to tell exactly how it's affecting your trial.
So how do you keep that from happening? Judge
It's
Wilson?
an excellent question. I think we all are searching for an answer to that. I think one piece might be if you explain to jurors why it's prohibited. You don't just say you may not do that. Jurors will
don't
say,
touch the stove.
Why,
right.
yeah, and why not? And especially if this is an important case, I know it's an important decision, the temptation is even higher to get all the information they can to make the right decision. And so I think to some extent it helps if we, the judges and lawyers, explain to jurors why they're not supposed to. For example, it's important that everybody have the same information about which that's being decided. Everybody knows if a witness took the witness stand and gave certain information, so that can be responded to. And that witness is under oath and can be cross-examined. Mm-hmm. So the first impression of what that person said may very well change after they've been cross-examined, and that can be explored. I sometimes say to jurors, I hate to be the one to break it to you, but not everything on the internet is true. But if people understand that that's part of the truth-finding process, and the fact-finding process includes everybody knowing the information on which they're making their decision, it helps them to resist that temptation a little bit. And they have to kind of police each other.
Mm-hmm. So when jurors are serving, we understand you're not supposed to do research, but what about sending out a tweet? This, look me, I'm doing this, or I'm thinking about this. Is that also prohibited?
It is, for different reasons. And part of that has to do with maintaining our promise of the integrity and fairness of the process. I think it's easy for people to see with the judge. If I were sending out messages or emails all the time in the middle of trial, oh, you won't believe this, what this witness just said, or what's going on in my courtroom, or boy, that sounded like a bunch of, and so on. And if a party got a wind of that, I think they'd have good reason to wonder if they were going to get a fair trial, if I really was going to keep an open mind until I'd heard the entire case and argument. And the same thing's true for jurors. If they're sending out these little messages and signals about how they're feeling about what they're hearing, it leaves people doubting that in the end it will have been a fair process.
People who haven't served on juries may not be aware that you can't discuss the case at all until you're charged and you go back in the room and you deliberate. And that's actually, it's very hard for people to do that. Other jurors will stop you from saying, well, geez, don't you think that? And it just corrupts the process in such a terrific way to put that in. Put that into play, put those thoughts into play.
So if you're serving on a juror, leave your Twitter feed at home.
Yes.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground, but even faced with all these challenges, the jury trial is still a mainstay of our judicial system. So let's go back to the jurors we heard from earlier and see what they had to say about their overall experience.
I think most people, that all they know about how it works is from like Law and Order or Perry Mason or whatever, but it's not like that at all. I found it fascinating, really interesting.
I think the jury, for me, all said and done, was a worthwhile experience because I had never seen that system in action before.
I was able to really get kind of a behind the curtain look at what happens in a courtroom, what happens between judges and lawyers, and what happens in the deliberation room. That was really, really exciting. You know, yes, we've got court shows, but there's nothing like the real thing.
I do remember my parents being called for jury duty and knowing when they were called. I think that, you know, they educated me as a young person. Well, this is what I have to go do. It's my civic duty. So I guess I always knew that. But I think actually being on a jury made me realize that it was important.
It's what we do, and it's how we keep the wheels of justice turning in this country.
It did make me feel like I was doing a civic duty, you know, doing something for the greater good.
I'd hope there'd be somebody like me on my jury.
We talk about fair trials and juries of your peers, and the only way we get those juries of our peers is if people participate in their civic duty.
Everybody should serve on a jury at least once.
Welcome back to Legal Logic. There were some positive comments from the jury service there, from the people that were asked those questions. I'm just curious, some of them said, oh, it's not like TV, it's not like Law and Order. Maybe Kirsten, you can explain, what's it really like? Why is it not like TV?
Well, it depends, again, on the case. There are cases I've handled that are like the cases that you see on TV, and jurors are surprised and amazed, and it's in fact more interesting for them because it's real life and real lives. But there are a lot of mundane topics, and when people are arguing over money or the interpretation of a contract, those aren't the types of cases that you tend to see on TV. And there can be criminal cases that are similarly not particularly sexy, but nevertheless, it's a crime. And so it depends on the circumstances, but there's a lot of waiting, there's a lot of behind the scenes things going on that, of course, is all filtered out when you watch it on TV.
So it seems to me, too, from some of the comments that people found it to be a very valuable experience, that perhaps jurors being the center of the legal system is important. And I'd like to hear from all of you about your thoughts on that.
I definitely think it's very important. We're not Egypt, we're not Venezuela or El Salvador, and the jury system really allows the common man and the common woman to have a voice in the government and to right wrongs and to filter out cases that are BS or don't have merit, or on the other hand to allow the little guy to stand up against large corporations or against the government or against the police if that's appropriate. Without a jury system, we'd be relying on people to make those decisions that might not make the tough decisions.
And Judge Wilson, maybe you can talk about what the last person said about serving as a civic duty.
Well, it is a civic duty, and I think part of what you hear in these comments reflects that not only is jury service important for the resolution of individual cases, it's important to our society that we have jury trials and that people come and they serve. Alex de Tocqueville commented a century and a half ago that serving on juries was an important part of people learning about how their government works. And social scientists in the last decade have confirmed that when people serve on juries, their level of civic engagement goes up. They vote more frequently, they become involved more in their communities in other ways. It's good for society.
I agree with that. And what about with the criminal system? Kirsten, how have you seen the jury benefit the criminal system?
Well, to kind of echo a lot of what others have said, it is a unique way for folks who can sometimes feel very unengaged with their government to feel involved, to feel like they directly have a say, and to know that their voice is heard, to gain confidence that government is being administered justly, fairly. And that's never more important than it is when you're talking about somebody's freedom, and how important we all hold that notion that it is better, even though justice would, if it were perfect, no one who was guilty would go free, but it's better to see someone go free than to see that innocent person incarcerated. And if you ask jurors that, they almost always agree with that. And being part of that process helps jurors feel confident that the right decision was made.
Yeah, justice is definitely a collective agreement, and this is where it comes from. It's got to be this way. We interview a lot of jurors, not in Oregon, but around the country after they've come to verdict, and they uniformly, praise the system, like the experience. Thought they'll frequently say it was the most important decision of their life outside of the important, personal decisions they make in their life. So it's definitely, and it's a moving thing. And when they come to that decision, they believe that they're right. That's what it's for.
Well, that's about all that we have time for today. I hope you've enjoyed our conversation this time on legal logic. I'd like to thank our guests for their very thoughtful observations and participation about the jury system. I hope that we've established that serving on a jury is a difficult and demanding task, yet it's an exceptionally rewarding experience. Of all the players in the courtroom, perhaps the most important are the jurors. So, if you feel that you have an open mind and you are willing to set aside personal feelings or biases and can act with impartiality, then the next time you receive a jury summons, please participate. Jury service is a significant civic responsibility and a basic duty of our citizenship. Remember, jury service is something we literally fought for. It is a vital part of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. I'm Bonnie Richardson. Until next time.